Chapter 5. Anthropology. Adam, Adamites, and the Science of Ethnology. The pre-Adamites had certainly come to dwell with theologians and writers of popular apologetics. This does not mean, however, that they did not occupy other cultural spaces too. They showed up, for example, in works with little concern for accommodating theology to scientific developments. Indeed, the language of pre-Adamism could function as nothing more than a means of challenging the august authority of the Old Testament in matters of anthropological history, and to that degree at least perpetuated something of the skeptical impetus associated with the theory's earlier incarnations. At the same time, it also continued to feature in more dedicated scientific locations among those whose empirical inquiries remained, to one degree or another, fixed to biblical moorings. The diversity of opinions expressed on human origins in these arenas allowed for a variety of reactions to the pre-Adamite proposal from different religious perspectives, with some espousing it, others dismissing it out of hand, and yet others allowing it as a possibility should the anthropological and archaeological evidence move decisively in favor of polygonism. This chapter charts this stretch of the story among those for whom pre-Adamism remained necessarily polygenetic. We leave the transformation, effected to some degree by Darwin, of polygenetic pre-Adamism into a monogenetic form until the next chapter. Before turning to the ways in which it persisted among professionalizing ethnologists, one particular use of pre-Adamite discourse merits comment. In this case it simply served as surrogate for primordial polygonism and the existence of ancient cultures predating recorded Hebrew history. Just the year before McCausland's rendition of pre-Adamism first appeared, another book-length work on the subject, this time written from a markedly different spiritual address, crystallized. A rambling, unwieldy, and repetitious compendium, Pre-Adamite Man first appeared in 1863 under the pseudonym Griffith Lee. In fact, it was the work of Pascal Beverly Randolph, a medical doctor, human rights champion, mystic spiritualist, and supreme Grand Master of the American branch of the Rosicrucian Order, Fraternitas Rosae Crucis, a confraternity that continued to attract those with esoteric interests in alchemy, Gnosticism, magic, and the Paracelsian tradition. Randolph was a controversial figure, and his teachings on occult sexuality, perceived at the time as free love and, later, as the precursor of ceremonial sex magic, resulted in a brief period of imprisonment in 1872, before he was reportedly acquitted of all charges. His literary output was extensive. He was the author of some 50 books and pamphlets on health, philosophical arcana, magia sexualis, and the occult. In all likelihood pre-Adamite Man's initial pseudonymity was intended to protect its author from direct censure, for, as Randolph observed in the preface to the fourth edition, the book has had mountains almost insurmountable in its path, although, in his own opinion at least, it had outlived adversity, and become a standard authority in the world of letters. Others didn't think so. As one reviewer bitingly put it, it is not worthy of perusal by Christian, Jew, or infidel. It is a work of great pretensions, but of no originality or merit. The thoughts are exceedingly crude and disjointed, the statements even of pretended facts are unreliable, and most of the quotations are inaccurate, and the style is awkward and often ungrammatical. As to the plan, there is none. These drawbacks notwithstanding, the book's general impulse is readily discernible. Its purpose was simply to lay out what Randolph took to be the standard evidence from linguistics, anthropology, archaeology, paleontology, and ancient history for the existence of humans long before the time frame that the biblical chronology for Adam could allow. Like other polygonists, Randolph rejected climatic accounts of racial differentiation. Commenting on the black race, for example, he noted, "Climate, therefore, had nothing to do in making him the hue he is, for in Africa, beneath the torrid sun, and in cold Icelandic regions, he and his children retain the same complexion. He must, therefore, be a distinct species of the genus Homo, for, differing so totally from the sons of Adam, he could not have descended from the same source, and is consequently, and beyond all doubt, a pre-Adamite man." This characterization, however, did not imply any inherent inability to progress. Indeed, Randolph insisted that the black race was destined for power and greatness and dedicated the first edition of the work to Abraham Lincoln, a close personal friend and fellow Rosicrucian, though he did wax lyrical in his praise of European cultural superiority, a superiority of structure and function, a superiority of temperament and material, a superiority of blood and race. No doubt we discern here, too, a complex psychology in operation, for Randolph vehemently denied having any black ancestry when his enemies hurled at him the accusation that he was of Negro descent. What is also notable about Randolph's intervention is that he was not at all motivated by any concern to use the language of pre-Adamism as a strategy for reconciling science and the Bible. In fact, he took issue specifically with the harmonizing tactics of scriptural geologists. Attempts to read the days of creation as geological epochs did nothing but ensure that the grand and simple story is perverted, defaced and stultified by interpretations and exegeses, as violent as they can be, and such as would drive the writers of Genesis to distraction. At every turn his passion was to ensure that theology gave way to science. It is for theology to suit herself to the requirements of advancing knowledge. She may struggle for a while, only to yield in the end. Announcing his unorthodoxy at several points, he anticipated the survival of ethical Christianity, or what he called practical Christianity, while welcoming the demise of its theological, or mystical, components, and rejected the Incarnation, disavowing as incredulous the belief that the infinite, awful, eternal One ever had a child by any woman in the physical sense, virgin or matron. Besides, Randolph happily welcomed the most recent installment of Bishop Colenso's critical reading of the Pentateuch, one of a set of treatises uniformly excoriated by conservative believers, which he deemed another eloquent protest against the historical inaccuracies of the Book of Genesis. He elaborated, too, on the fictions of chronology, both biblical and classical, through its typical resort to genealogical conventions, calendrical peculiarities, and numerological fixations, and insisted that the Genesis text, no more than one of a range of Oriental cosmogonies, was the collation of various documentary fragments. In sum, Randolph was not troubled about whether or not Adam was a myth, though he was inclined to believe that there had been an ancient Adamite people. His passion was simply to demonstrate the antiquity of the human race. As he himself put it, the Adam of Genesis may be a myth, he may have been a miraculously created man, he may have been an immigrant from other parts of Asia, or he may be the ideal hero of the poets who sung, of Auld Lang Syne when this world was 6,000 years younger than it is today. In either case it matters little, so long as we can prove man's antiquity to be immeasurably greater than is usually believed. For Randolph, pre-Adamite vocabulary was merely a surrogate label for an ancient humanity entirely separate from the line charted in the legends of the Hebrew people. Pre-Adamite anthropology. If Randolph's pre-Adamism advertises the esoteric fringes where the theory found a foothold, it would be mistaken to think that this was its natural environment or that it only surfaced in works of theological apologetic and thus had no place at the hub of the intellectual establishment. In fact, throughout the middle decades of 19th-century Britain, the idea of a pre-Adamite humanity thrived as part of the conventional discourse of the new sciences of anthropology and ethnology. This is plain, for example, from a reading of the Proceedings of the Ethnological Society of London, which had originally come into being in the 1840s, at the instigation of Thomas Hodgkin, as an offshoot of the Aborigines Protection Society, though concerning itself rather more with the scientific study of the natural history of the human species than with humanitarianism. But the society had gone into decline during the 1850s and was later reinvigorated by a group of anthropologists and archaeologists representing the newer trends in their subjects. Soon, however, cracks began to appear, and friction with the older Quaker humanitarian element in the Ethnological Society resulted in the formation of the Breakaway Anthropological Society in 1863. The details of this institutional chapter in the history of British anthropology need not detain us here, save to say that the new society represented a tougher polygenetic and racialist line of thinking. As we shall later see, the writings of certain key members, such as James Hunt and Robert Knox, display a much more secularized polygonism that should not be conflated with religiously inspired pre-Adamism. But others who participated in the Society's scientific inquiries into human antiquity and diffusion at mid-century still found sustenance in the idea of Adam's predecessors. Crawford's linguistic polygonism. During the life of the Ethnological Society, the name of the aging John Crawford, a close associate of the eminent geologist Roderick Murchison, featured prominently. Crawford, who played a major role as president and vice president, was an Indian Army doctor turned Orientalist, an East India Company resident at Singapore, and from 1818 a Fellow of the Royal Society. Author of the very successful 3-volume History of the Indian Archipelago, in which he elaborated in extenso on the spectrum of cultural forms, from anarchy to despotism, that he had discerned during his time in tropical Asia, he steadfastly promoted polygonism from a variety of perspectives ranging from physical anthropology to philology. That the many separate and distinct races of man are originally created species, and not mere varieties of a single family, he told his fellow members of the Ethnological Society in 1861, there are many facts to show. Predictably, He accorded a minimal role to the influence of physical and social environment on human physiology. Neither form nor stature nor complexion were subject to climatic modification or to the effects of diet. Race, simply, was the product of creation, not of climate, and still less of evolution. And he was entirely content to leave his explanation there. It had simply pleased the Creator, for reasons inscrutable to us, to plant certain fair races in the temperate regions of Europe, and there only, and certain black ones in the tropical and subtropical regions of Africa and Asia, to the exclusion of white ones. What was certain was that climate has nothing to do with the matter. The story of human origins, he told the readers of the Ethnological Society's Transactions, went something like this: when man was first called into existence, we may conjecture that he was planted over the earth in many small families or groups, often consisting of distinct species, or when not so of a single species, adapted to a variety of climates. In such an isolated state, each little group would construct its own separate language. And hence the multiplicity of tongues, and the variety of words and structures. This stance was reinforced by his profound antipathy to the Aryan theory of language origins of which Max Mola was the chief architect. While Mola in fact argued for the separation of ethnology and philology, there still remained many good reasons to join them. The earlier tradition of linking racial monogenism with language remained attractive to some, such as R.G. Latham, author of Man and His Migrations, who, while acknowledging that some ethnologists had made too much of linguistic evidence for racial unity, was nonetheless sure that anatomists, archaeologists, and physical anthropologists had made too little of it. Darwin's own suggestion that linguistic diversification was a fruitful way of thinking about a genealogical arrangement of the races of men further confirmed the association. Crawford retained the connection, but his conclusions were radically different from the monogenist cast of Darwin's transmutationism. His own comparative analysis of numerous words in different vocabularies confirmed his judgment that the theory which makes all the languages of Europe and Asia to be of one and the same race of man, is utterly groundless and the mere dream of very learned men. Language, because it was acquired rather than innate, was simply not a safe guide to race. So committed was Crawford to this scheme that he dismissed James Cowles Pritchard's monogenism as a monstrous supposition hardly worthy of serious refutation. Throughout his Transactions essays and elsewhere, Crawford's descriptions were punctuated with periodic commentary on the physiological and cultural inferiority of particular races, and yet he remained steadfastly opposed to slavery, a stance revealing that Pelagianism was not invariably cast as scientific underwriter to the ideology of Slavocracy. Nevertheless, by placing different races in different regional locations, the Creator had suited racial culture to climatic circumstance. Climates were sufficiently powerful to keep races in their proper places. Mere intemperance of climate, he informed his readers in 1863, is sufficient to prevent man from making any advance towards civilization, and to hold him permanently in the savage state, and the races of man which inhabit Africa correspond with the disadvantages of its physical geography. Pre-Adamites among the anthropologists. Crawford was certainly not alone among members of the Ethnological Society in his belief in the creation of non-Adamic humans. On the basis of his findings in Egyptian ethnology, for example, Reginald Stuart Poole insisted on the persistence of racial form and explicitly endorsed the double Adamism of his uncle in a paper read before the Society in June 1862. Convinced that permanence of type involves at least duality of origin, he nonetheless wanted to assure his audience that he was concerned to rebut any charge that he set no value upon the biblical indications of the origin of man. He also hastened to dissociate himself from the nasty racialist implications that American Southerners had drawn from Pelagianism and the belief in racial hierarchy. No ethnological theory or fact can shake the first principles of Christian morality, he insisted, wryly adding that belief in the common ancestry of the human species had not prevented good monogenists in America's southern states from abusing African Americans. For that matter, belief in the unity of man had done nothing to deliver the Negro in the northern states any social recognition. In fact, he went on to insist that the very knowledge that an inferior race had a separate origin, should rather arouse our generosity than awaken our dislike, and be an incentive to liberality rather than to tyranny. The following year, 1864, in February, the Indian-born Reverend Frederick W. Farrar, novelist, philologist, and later Dean of Canterbury, supported George Clayton in challenging the idea that the universality of the deluge, and the unity of the human race, enjoyed the supporting witness of non-Semitic traditions, as was often suggested. This paved the way for the November meeting of the Ethnological Society, at which Farrar presented the same audience with what he considered superabundant scientific testimony to the fixity of type and the impotence of climate, urging his readers to draw from his catalogue such inferences as appear. to be most truthful and logical. His work on primitive language brought him to the admiring attention of Darwin, who proposed him for Fellowship of the Royal Society in 1864. Farrar later repaid the compliment by arranging, controversially, for Darwin's burial in Westminster Abbey and preaching the funeral sermon. The inferences to be drawn from Farrar's challenge, of course, were hardly uniform, and different members of the society reacted in different ways. On the one hand, there were those who continued to believe that even if the idea of polyganism were to be verified, it would leave the question of the specific unity of humankind entirely untouched. On the other, there were those who pressed a more secular polyganism into the service of the harshest of racial ideologies. For the moment, the salient point is that debate rotating around the issue of multiple atoms and divine creations of distinct human types were part of the conventional discourse of anthropology at mid-century. Farrar himself, for example, reviewed the evidence from philological history and the distinctions between monosyllabic, agglutinate, and inflectional languages for the Ethnological Society in May 1865 in order to support his claim that the scriptural tradition which referred the diversity of language to a direct miracle shows a recognition of the fact. Language families were primordial. Taking Reverend Farrar as emblematic, it is clear that the idea of non-Adamic humans was firmly embedded in certain strands of both anthropological and theological discourse. Even among the more materialist and secularist Anthropological Society membership, the theological pre-Adamite did not disappear from the scientific scene. Much was still made of La Peyrère and his role in the intellectual prehistory of polyganism. Thomas Bendish, for instance, one of the Society's vice presidents, outlined his crucial contributions in his memoir on the history of anthropology, dwelling on La Peyrére's role in the development of polyganism. A subsequent contributor, writing as Philalethes, set out to rescue La Peyrère no less from oblivion than from ignominy and compared his perfidious treatment at the hands of the self-designated orthodox to the virulence that the American physician and natural scientist Samuel George Morton had suffered from critics such as John Bachman and Thomas Smith, who vigorously held to the unity of the human race. For Philalethes, Louisiana Peyrère was to be understood not as a theological saboteur, as his latter-day critics alleged, but as a strategist in the cause of honest biblical interpretation unconstrained by despotic dogma. La Peyrère was to be revered both because he broke through the meshes of a groundless traditional prejudice, and proved that even in Scripture there are no decisive evidences of man's descent from a single pair, and because he showed that there are distinct indications of non-Adamite races. His acumen, his candor, and his courage were much to be admired. A sympathetic portrait of this Galileo-like figure, and the denunciation he received at the hands of the guardians of the sacred flame, provided a historical lesson that contemporary enemies of science were too slow to learn. Philalethes had in mind those berating the radical polyganism of Morton, and his acolytes in the American South, whose racial ideology will detain us in Chapter 7, and the archaeological revelations of Boucher de Perthes. Happily, Philalethes concluded, as each of these individuals had shown, the true thought of the solitary thinker in his closet is stronger than priests and princes, is omnipotent even against the banded conspiracies of the whole world's prejudice and interest. The strongly pro-science sentiments of Philalethes were themselves abundantly displayed again that same year, when, in a sympathetic account of Darwin's theory, he systematically demolished each of the features supposedly separating the human race from its animal counterparts. It was mistaken to seek to identify some discriminating trait, for there simply was no such point of distinction. Man does not form an order apart from the rest of the animal world. The radical continuity between human and animal was thereby cemented. The whole matter of Adam's language also surfaced within the new Anthropological Society. In a comprehensive review of Max Muller's Science of Language in 1863, Richard Stephen Charnock revisited several matters surrounding Adamic speech. The historical record on the subject, he confessed, was bewildering. Some writers maintained that the language spoken by Adam is lost, while others presented a baffling range of candidates. Reading had argued the case for Abyssinian, Sternhielm Rudbeckius for Swedish, Skinner for Belgic, Leif for Icelandic, Hugo for Latin, and many more. His own inclination was to resist Muller's linguistic monogenism, and reflecting on African and American languages, which did not enter Muller's scheme, he observed that they displayed characters and idioms of which it would be in vain to seek for traces in a primitive tongue. His review of the Adamic language debate and his elucidation of the linguistic taxonomy rooted in the account of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, thus served to keep the question of Adam and non-Adamic peoples in play. A few years later the president of the Manchester Anthropological Society, and from 1871 vice president of the London Anthropological Institute, Barrister and Registrar of the Bankruptcy Court in Manchester George Harris, elaborated on the distinctive character of the Adamite species in an essay on the plurality of races. The purpose here was to ascertain just how reliable the Bible was as an ally in the polygamist cause. Harris was not at all disposed to dispute the authority or the inspiration of the Bible, and while acknowledging that its purpose was not to provide scientific instruction, he evidently did want to secure its benediction on the idea of humanity's plural origins. The impression that Bible readers had that the sacred text taught universal descent from the Adamic family was simply mistaken. Plainly put, the Bible has not been allowed to speak for itself. In numerous passages the Genesis text simply presumed the existence of non-Adamic peoples, and Harris rehearsed again the sort of standard evidence that had been in circulation since the time of La Peyrère, concluding that the subsequent narrative of the Adamic line was only the story of the Hebrew people. By the late 1860s the idea of pre-Adamites as a reconciling tactic was obviously still circulating within the anthropological community. But it also served as a means of providing religious legitimation for the pluralist credo of a discipline that increasingly unsettled Christian assumptions about the unity of humankind and the moral imperatives that flowed from that doctrine. Commentators on theology and anthropology who did not hew to this polygamist line were less happily received, as George Moore, physician, polymathic author, Baptist layman, and grandfather of the philosopher G. E. Moore, bluntly found out. Even though Moore was willing to speak of the inferiority of certain races in his 1866 book on the first man and his place in creation, because he had attributed the emergence of the black races to the agency of climate rather than to original constitution, he found himself on the receiving end of James Hunt's scorn in the pages of the October 1866 issue of the Anthropological Review, in which he took up what he described as the remarkable fact that some Darwinists are monogenists, and, what is still more remarkable, that some Darwinites in this country are even now teaching as a scientific induction, that there is, at the present day, but one species of man inhabiting the globe. To Hunt, Moore's reckless speculations about that interesting creature the first man enjoyed both charming simplicity and no evidence. Another reviewer for the popular magazine of anthropology apparently considered Moore as a malicious, incoherent, scribbler whose efforts were fit only for elderly females of both sexes, and Sunday school children. Moore replied testily. The exchange reveals that while Peyrerian-style theology was tolerated, no doubt because it conformed to prevailing anthropological orthodoxy in that quarter, monogenous doctrine was lampooned at best, denounced at worst. Early in the following decade, in 1872, when the Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland brought together the earlier rival ethnological and anthropological factions, Charles Stanley Wake, Egyptologist and student of marriage, kinship, and ancient symbol worship, also took as his subject the Adamites for the readers of the first volume of the new Institute's journal. A decade or so earlier he had argued, against Huxley and various materialists, that human superiority over the rest of the animal world resided in a superior spiritual nature, and not just in humankind's intellectual or linguistic capacities. Physiologically, in terms of the nervous system and emotional expression, there were certainly continuities between human and animal, by virtue, too, of their capacity to experience emotion, thought, and mental action. Animals were possessed of a certain principle that we call the soul. It was only the spiritual powers of mental abstraction and generalization that definitively separated the human and animal creations. And having mapped that boundary to his satisfaction, Wake now wanted to engage in other forms of anthropological cartography. The burden of this later presentation was thus to find scientifically robust measures by which to discriminate effectively between Adamites and pre-Adamites. His own belief was that the dolichocephalic, or long-headed, pre-Adamic stock was essentially different from the brachycephalic Turanian and Aryan peoples of Asia and Europe, with the Hamite and Semitic peoples of Western Asia and Northern Africa. Wake's interlocutors did not concur. Carter Blake, then lecturer in comparative anatomy at the Westminster Hospital School of Medicine, secretary of the Anthropological Society, and severe critic of T.H. Huxley's stance on human evolution, certainly found Wake's paper arresting, but he felt it suffered from the fatal flaw that the Hebrews, who claimed especially to be descendants of Adam, were undoubtedly dolichocephalous. What was not challenged was the whole project of seeking reliable means of dividing humanity into a bipolar Adamite-pre-Adamite taxonomy. Adamic anthropology. The multiple Adam thesis that was beginning to find favor with some Christian apologists was supplemented by advocates among members of the growing community of anthropologists. But this certainly does not mean that adherence to traditional Adamic anthropology had disappeared. Some rejected the pre-Adamite proposal out of hand, though others, while refusing to embrace it, held it as a provisional option, allowing it as a potential harmonizing policy should the scientific evidence move conclusively against monogenism. Religious resistance, empirical assault, or anticipative apologetics were choices available to detractors. Pritchard's defense. Opponents of polygenism could still call upon the towering, if fading, authority of James Cowles Pritchard, whose celebrated critique of Lord Kames was still widely read. His researches into the physical history of man, which first appeared in 1813 and was expanded into 5 volumes by its third edition, and the Natural History of Man of 1843, which had gone into its 4th edition by 1855, remained influential for many. That was the case at least until the advent of E. B. Tyler's evolutionism during the 1860s, despite those critics such as Gustave Deichfel, Arthur de Gobineau, and Paul Broca who thought of him as emblematic of old-fashioned biblicism. Pritchard had progressively moved toward environmentalism in order to preserve his monogenous stance in the face of ever more assertive polygenetic challenges from British, European continental, and American sources. Having grown up as a Quaker and later felt the influence of evangelicalism, Pritchard, too, was profoundly committed to universal descent from Adam and thus found himself looking more and more to climate to explain somatic differences among racial groups. After all, he demonstrated his commitment to the truth of the Mosaic Chronicle by seeking to accommodate the Genesis days of creation to geological periods and in his insistence that religion had not naturally developed but was, rather, a divine revelation. Early in his career Pritchard had considered civilization as a race-forming factor, arguing that it stimulated variation in a way rather akin to the processes of domestication. But he increasingly moved toward identifying a correlation between climate and physical type while remaining ever sensitive to the excesses to which environmentalism had been put and repudiating the absurd theory held by the otherwise ingenious Stanhope Smith and, more reprehensibly, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who attributed black skin to bile secretions induced by the heat of the sun. By resorting to the influence of natural environment, the door was open to the drawing of analogies between human and animal development. Accordingly, Pritchard cited the opinion of M. Poulin in support of the view that acclimatization consists in certain permanent changes produced in the constitution of animals, which bring it into a state of adaptation to the climate. And while Poulin and Pritchard stopped short of species transformation, the Lamarckian core of their views on hereditary transmission is plain in Pritchard's reporting of the following facts established by Poulin: permanent changes or modifications in the functions of animal life may be affected by long-continued changes in the habitudes which influence these functions. Hereditary instincts may be formed, some animals transmitting to their offspring acquired habits. Certainly, Pritchard never wholeheartedly embraced Lamarckism, but as Stocking points out, he increasingly retreated, like Darwin, toward it. If the climatic adaptations of animal species could be interpreted naturalistically, there was little reason to exempt the human species from the selfsame agents of change. Pritchard's, like Smith's, racial account was thus inherently evolutionary rather than creationist and drew attention to his view of race as being far from fixed. As he put it, all the diversities which exist are variable, and pass into each other by insensible gradations. For Pritchard, however, one component of his anthropological system disquieted many. Deeply convinced of progressive development from savagery toward civilization, although taken overall, as Stocking makes clear, his thinking is possibly better typified as diffusionist rather than developmentalist, and what seemed to him its self-evident corollary, progress from black to white. Pritchard suggested that the primitive stock of man were Negroes. Whether or not he meant that Adam, in the state of perfection, was black has been queried, but however that question resolves, Pritchard shared the idea of primitive blackness with the Cambridge physician John Ellis Towne and the physiologist John Hunter. Regardless, his authority lingered among certain factions of the ethnological community, despite the assault of several strategically placed individuals, not least because of his concerns about the racial abuse that colonists were inflicting on native peoples. At the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1839, for example, he provided a grisly litany of what he termed the extinction of races as part of a recruiting campaign for the Aborigines Protection Society, whose motto Ab Uno Sanguine underscored humanity's essential unity. That influence extended to the leading advocate of monogenism in archaeology, the Scottish president of the University of Toronto, Sir Daniel Wilson, who for decades issued critical commentary from his Canadian vantage point on the militant, secular polyganism being peddled in the American South and argued the case for the physical and moral excellence of mixed races. Adams advocates. Back at the Ethnological Society, when the Havana judge James Kennedy examined the question of the origin of the American Indians in March 1854, He expressed profound disquiet at those who countenanced the idea that there were originally various distinct creations of beings of the human race. Such a stance was contrary to our faith that God hath made of one blood all the nations of the earth. In his judgment, the available data tended to prove the correctness of the account given us in the Mosaic history, taken merely as history. Kennedy's opinions, which drew sustenance from the eminent inquiries of our late respected President, Dr. Pritchard, were reinforced by those of Darwin's Beagle captain, the hydrographer and meteorologist Robert Fitzroy, now Admiral, who told a society in 1861 that racial variation could occur very rapidly under certain conditions, mostly through intermarriage, and that this, together with patterns of geographical migration, could fully account for the nature and distribution of human occupancy of the earth. These circumstances, alongside observed affiliations between language groups, provided him with what he considered to be overwhelming evidence in exact accordance with the historical account in the Bible and, in particular, with the narrative of Noah's children, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Part and parcel of this web of conviction was Fitzroy's belief, too, that when he was cursed the mark set on Cain and his descendants was Negro blackness. Or take the case of Robert Dunn, a clinical psychologist, member of William B. Carpenter's informal physiological psychology network, and fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, who repeatedly argued the case for the unity of mankind from anthropometric measurements of human crania and cerebral physiology, from the tegumentary differences between races, as well as from psychology. As might be expected, Dunn granted considerable influence to the role of environment in modifying skin color and hair character and went on to adduce unitary arguments from hybrid fertility. He could not let the moment pass, he confessed, without adverting to the confirmation which the revelations of the microscope have given to the dicta of Holy Writ that God had made of one blood all the nations of the earth. Yet he did make it clear nonetheless that, while the unity of the species by physiological and psychological evidence has been established, the quaestio vexata still remains. Have there been more creations than one of the same genus, more Adams and Eves than one single pair? He himself sided with the monogenism of Edward Forbes, R. G. Latham, William B. Carpenter, and Pritchard against Louis Agassiz, the supposition of the creation of several distinct protoplasts, one for each region of the globe, was not required to account for the geographical distribution of race. In these sentiments and in this conclusion, Dunn was pleased to report, "I think we must all cordially agree with Dr. Pritchard." Indeed, he repeated this same contention a few years later when he told the Ethnological Society that the one common bond of universal brotherhood stemmed from the fact that God made of one blood all the nations of the earth and endowed them all with the same animal, intellectual, moral, and religious nature. Divine origin, not necessarily lineal descent from an original single pair, was the warrant for a common humanity. But that conviction did not mean racial parity. The intellectual inferiority of the Bushman, the Australian, and the Negro to that of the Indo-European was striking. Continental reinforcements. Besides the long-standing authority of Pritchard, supporters of human descent from an Adamic pair could now call more and more on the scientific monogenism, even if not necessarily of the Adamic variety, being championed by the French naturalist Armand de Quatrefages. His conviction that racial difference was climatically induced exerted a profound influence on Isidore Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire and the French tradition of acclimatization. Even while president of the Société d'Anthropologie, Quatrefages stood out against many of the French anthropologists who favored Paul Broca's polygenetic views of race and who accounted for organic modification purely by interbreeding. Ever since observing the remarkable variability of domestic animals, which caused him to reject the belief that black and white humans belonged to different races, he relentlessly pressed the monogenist case with the zeal of the converted. Significantly, Quatrefages traced the history of polyganism back to its roots in La Peyrère's theology, noting that polyganism generally regarded as the result of free thought was biblical and dogmatic in origin. The history of monogenism was no less ideologically littered, and thus to avoid the taint of sectarian bias he hastily added that monogenists are guilty of seeking in religious doctrines arguments in favor of their theory, and anathematizing their adversaries in the name of dogma. As for himself, Quatrefages took seriously the findings of natural history and used the writings of figures such as Georges Louis Leclerc de Buffon, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and Georges Cuvier to support his critique of Agassiz's centers of creation. Moreover, he acknowledged that stances taken up on such scientific questions as variation, migration, and acclimatization were invariably conditioned by commitments to monogenism or polyganism. Later the geographer and anthropologist Oscar Peschel was to argue that the polygamist belief that different human species were at once sown broadcast by the Creator, in numbers as vast as swarms of bees, was a departure from sound scientific principle. Any explanation of the present by the past is thus abandoned, he went on, although it lies deeply rooted in human nature not to rest satisfied with observed facts until they have been reduced under some law of necessity. His objection, to put it another way, was that Pelagianism departed from sound inductive inquiry. Sound inductive inquiry, for the distinguished anatomist and physiologist Rudolf Wagner, Blumenbach's successor at Göttingen, meant scientific agnosticism on Pelagianism. Wagner was well known as a vigorous opponent of German materialism, in particular, Karl Vogt, and in a famous address to the Assembly of German Naturalists and Physicians, in 1854, he threw down the gauntlet and aroused the fury of materialists by postulating the existence of a soul substance and arguing that for ethical reasons science needed to retain belief in God. Vogt snapped back, insisting that true science had inescapable anti-idealist and atheistic consequences. His response served to polemicize the relationship between science and religion by focusing it around a sequence of bipolarities: science versus obscurantism, materialism versus idealism, spontaneous generation versus creation. Parts of Wagner's original presentation were republished nearly a decade later in the newly founded Anthropological Review for 1863, though with an editorial note informing readers that several passages touching on the supposed connection of the science of man with historical Christianity and revelation have not been translated, as these subjects have nothing to do with anthropology. What is significant in the present context, however, is that Wagner had made it clear that he was chary of the inclination of too many anthropologists to elaborate more and more atoms and paradises, some of whom had got up to as many as 15 or 16 atoms. This result, no doubt, appeared highly satisfactory to slaveholders, Wagner wryly noted, but in fact the mode by which races have been formed is perfectly unknown because it reached back to a primordial time perfectly inaccessible to science. His own inclination, quite irrespective of my religious convictions, was that all races could indeed be reduced to one original existing, but only to an ideal type, to which the Indo-European type approached nearest. What also reinforced this belief was Wagner's sense that the advent of Darwinism had reversed the image that the theory of descent from an original pair was scientifically antiquated. There was, of course, nothing inevitable about the link Wagner presumed between monogenism and abolition, as James Reddy made clear in his discussion of slavery for readers of the Anthropological Review the following year, 1864. The proposition that all men are created equal, Reddy began, was widely assumed to be undeniable. The trouble was that it was just utterly false. Whether there were any implications in this realization for the practice of slavery was a subject on which Reddy affected to keep an open mind, claiming instead that his aim was to lay before his readers what was really best for mankind as a whole. Religiously, he noted, there was little to be said in favor of abolition, at least from a reading of the Bible. Indeed, it was notable that though the writers, both of the Old and New Testaments, were unacquainted with any other than a monogenous theory, we do not find a syllable in any of their writings condemnatory of slavery. Religious arguments against the institution, therefore, were utterly untenable and groundless. Besides scriptural testimony, Reddy believed that he could point to manifold evil consequences that had flowed from manumission in the United States. It was far from obvious that the abolitionists had ethics on their side. On the scientific front, he found repugnant a recent American treatise advocating miscegenation, a newly available rebuttal of this filthy theory hoping to restore the normal relation of the races had, unfortunately, spoiled a very tolerable thesis, by Yankee extravagance. In any case, Reddy's concern was to detach the slavery question from the monogenist and Pelagianist theories of the origin of mankind. Whether all men are descended from a single atom or not was simply irrelevant to the question of racial equality because the Bible itself bore witness to the permanence of racial features and passed no judgment on the practice of slavery. He himself felt drawn to the older tradition of the descent of mankind from a single pair but was nonetheless convinced that some races were substandard. The only question to be posed was thus, while the inferior grades are actually inferior, how is it best for the higher races to deal with them? This species of monogenism was attractive to some slaveholders in the American South who held tenaciously to the Adamic story precisely because biblical literalism could secure a scriptural justification for slavocracy. Refusal pronounced. The continued survival of scientific monogenism among individuals like these not only provided reinforcements for those skeptical about Pelagianism on empirical grounds but also convinced many that its pre- and co-Adamite versions occupied forbidden theological territory. The doctrine of the unity of the human species that underlay the monogenism of Stanhope Smith, Pritchard, Blumenbach, and Quatrefages came to the surface no less in theological works than in scientific discourse. In Smith's own institution, Princeton, The Presbyterian tradition steadfastly hewed to the monogenes line. In 1829, for example, Archibald Alexander, who drew up the blueprint that would guide Princeton theology for a century and through whom Old School Presbyterianism received its baptism in Scottish common-sense philosophy, turned his attention to the relationship between Scripture and nature. Here he dismissed the idea that there were men before Adam as destitute of all shadow of proof, suggested that the varieties of the human species were due to the great difference of climate and other circumstances of the nations of the earth, and declared as a prejudice without foundation, the belief, that the color of the whites was that of the first man. Alexander speculated, like others after him, that Adam was neither white nor black and that it was much more probable that our first parents were red men or of an olive or copper color. He based this judgment on his understanding that in Hebrew the radical signification of Adam is red. Later, also at the Princeton Theological Seminary, Charles Hodge similarly defended the unity of the human race, as did Benjamin B. Warfield, who, as we shall see, was able to integrate it both with evolutionary theory and with a newer form of pre-Adamism. Hodge, for example, despite his admiration for Louis Agassiz, would not compromise on the question of humanity's common origin and called upon the researches of his Princeton colleague William Henry Green on the nature of biblical genealogies to extend the traditional time available for a racial differentiation since the Adamic creation. To him the virulent polygonism of Glidden and Josiah Clark Nutt's types of mankind was subversive of genuine religion and social polity alike. Such matters were infinitely more threatening than Copernican astronomy or Lyellian geology, for to Hodge they struck at the very heart of Christian theology and human identity and thereby compromised the moral nature of humankind. On the other side of the Atlantic, in Britain, conventional Adamic anthropology continued to be represented in both popular and more serious theological works. In a lecture delivered in Exeter Hall in December 1848, for example, Reverend William Brock directed his YMCA listeners to the subject of the common origin of the human race. Patching together a pastiche of popular philology, physical anthropology, and psychology, the rhetorician urged the common origin of mankind upon his young hearers. With exuberant enthusiasm he concluded his homily with an appeal to human solidarity as the basis for evangelistic endeavor. It was a similar story for Elisha Noyce, too, whose outlines of creation for juvenile readers likewise held up monogenism as the only respectable scientific option. In Scotland evangelical Calvinists were certainly no more inclined toward polygonism. In 1850, for example, Hugh Miller, though widely applauded by pre-Adamite partisans for his scheme of harmonizing Genesis and geology, made it clear that he would have none of the fashionable polygenetic talk. To him the whole soteriological structure of Christianity rested on the assumption of the specific unity of the human race, and any notion that Adams and Eves were many had to be ruled out simply because, as he put it, the second Adam died but for the descendants of the first. Miller's essay was in fact an extended commentary on Thomas Smith's volume on the unity of the human races, a work berating those polygonists, notably Agassiz, whose claims were circulating in fashionable circles in the American South, and while he took the same anthropological line, he felt that Smith had perhaps been too precipitate in arguing that both blacks and blue-eyed Goths could not have descended naturally from a common origin. To be sure, supernatural intervention could not be ruled out, a priori, but with a typically Calvinist suspicion of multiplying miracles gratuitously, he proposed that the horns of the dilemma would be removed if it were assumed that Adam was neither black nor white but, rather, a mingled Negroid and Caucasian type. If so, then neither the Goth nor the Negro would be so extreme a variety of the species as to be beyond the power of natural causes to produce. Miller's antipathy to the plural origins of humankind was shared by his Free Church of Scotland colleague John Duns, Professor of Natural Science at New College, Edinburgh, from 1864 until 1903, as successor to the distinguished John Fleming. The relationship between science and faith was Duns's scholarly passion, and it was only to be expected that the challenge of the newest anthropology would sooner or later come to the surface in his writings. In Science and Christian Thought and Biblical Natural Science, both of which appeared in the mid-1860s, he thus tackled the question of the antiquity of the human species. In the tradition of Calvinistic epistemology, Duns made it clear throughout these works that his science was grounded in Christian presuppositions and that the claims of the biblical worldview should be taken on the principle of initial credulity, at least until its insecurity is clearly and triumphantly shown. The scriptural record, taken prima facie, plainly indicated a monogenist position, and Duns only found this confirmed as he perused the arguments and sifted the data of natural historians, philologists, and anthropologists alike. Moreover, Duns found himself revolted no less by the evolutionary musings of Carl Vogt than by the ethical relativism of continental materialists and by the racist undercurrents among the American Mortonites, and he thus set himself the task of refuting the underlying naturalistic philosophy. Duns's survey of the pertinent scientific literature was prolix, but his familiarity with the sources of the newest science did nothing to weaken his resolute adherence to the Adamic world picture. Again following the well-worn path of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, James Cowles Pritchard, and R.G. Latham, he looked to the power of habitat, climate and alike to produce as great variations among the peoples of the world as among the lower animals, thereby paradoxically connecting up animal and human in a single explanatory network. Is there a greater unlikeness between the head of the Negro, the Aboriginal Australian, the European, and the Hindu, he rhetorically asked, than there is between the head of the greyhound and that of the mastiff or the bulldog? As for human language, he called on the authority of Wilhelm von Humboldt, Max Muller, and C.C.J. Bunsen to confirm that all linguistic variations could well have sprung from a single source. The very highest authorities in the science of language, he reported, unite in bearing testimony to the original unity of language and the unity of man. The sciences, it seemed, were on the side of Scripture, as was morality, for Duns slyly remarked that it was only to be expected of the Morton-Not-Glidden Brigade that in their portrait of universal race history they would assign a foremost place to the families to which they themselves belong. They might have done this, Duns further sniped, without attempting to unsoul others farther removed from the early centers of civilization. Interwoven with the fabric of Duns's diagnosis, of course, were theological threads. And so, while scrutinizing archaeological and geological evidence of human antiquity, from Danish jockey knottings, kitchen middens, lake dwellings, peat deposits from Scotland, and swamp cypress in Mississippi as well as other paleobotanical data, and consistently reinterpreting it to shorten the time scale, he spelled out in detail the biblical objections to the pre-Adamism of the recently published Genesis of the Earth and Man and Pre-Adamite Man. Chief among these were St. Paul's theology of original sin, which presumed that all humankind had descended from the Old Testament Adam, and what he considered to be the gratuitous and unwarranted postulation of a double creation narrative in Genesis. Victorian Catholics were just as allergic to pre-Adamite speculations. Indeed, according to William Astor, Pelagianism was substantially more troubling to the Catholic mindset at the time than either geological time or evolutionary theory. Original sin was the pivotal dogmatic tenet that could not bear the weight of the multiple origin theory. Nicholas Patrick Wiseman, later Cardinal and first Archbishop of Westminster, for example, took up the whole subject in his 12 lectures on the connection between science and revealed religion delivered in 1835. Wiseman's intervention showed a remarkable familiarity with the state of play in a range of disciplines. Beginning with the study of language and ethnology, he moved on to the earth sciences, history, archaeology, and critical hermeneutics. His excursus addressed the larger question of the general relationship between science and Christianity, but it also got down to detailed questions such as numismatic challenges to some biblical texts, hermeneutic queries surrounding the prophecy of Isaiah, and how the recent discovery of certain ancient monuments confirmed a passage in Ezekiel. In his third and fourth lectures Wiseman turned to anthropology. And it became clear that, while he was happy to read the Genesis record through geological lenses, he was certain that any tampering with the doctrine of universal human descent from Adam endangered the very fabric of Catholicism, which was rooted in the deep mystery of original sin, and the glorious mystery of redemption. Having in his first two addresses demonstrated to his own satisfaction the possibility of deriving all languages from a common source and having secured the supporting testimony of modern ethnographers, that the language of men was originally one, he now called on the authority of both Pritchard and Blumenbach in his anthropological defense of Adamic monogenism. These writers were aligned on the side of truth. On the opposite flank stood the skeptical French naturalists, J. B. Bory de Saint-Vincent, Julien Joseph Viry, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. Wiseman abominated them. Viry's works, for example, were even more revolting than Bory de Saint-Vincent's, not least on account of his suspecting a certain fraternity between the Hottentot and the baboon. Lamarck had gone further still by arguing that a graduated, evolutionary chain existed throughout nature. Their collective demotion of the Adamic family to merely one of a number of early human communities was deeply troublesome. For his part Wiseman thought climate mainly sufficient to explain racial difference and outlined an explanation remarkably reminiscent of the natural selection mechanism. The different families or races among men may owe their origin to the casual rise of a variety which, under the influence of favorable circumstances, the isolation, for instance, of the family in which it began, and its subsequent intermarriages, became fixed and indelible in succeeding generations. To this he added commentary on the moral unity of humankind, confirming the existence of a moral sensibility identical through the entire race. All this confirmed that Adamic monogenism was more consoling to humanity than the degrading theories of Viry or Lamarck. In many ways Wiseman's intervention mapped out the route that Catholics would adopt on the polygamist question for several generations. In Germany, too, this selfsame position was promoted by the University of Bonn's professor of Catholic theology Franz Heinrich Reusch in his Bibel und Natur, which first appeared in 1862. The question of the unity of the human race preoccupied him for 3 chapters in this work on the Mosaic history of creation and its relation to natural science. Culling the writings of numerous scholars, notably, Pritchard, Humboldt, Quatrefages, Blumenbach, and Kemper, he reported in detail on various anthropometric measurements, insisting throughout that polyganism was unwarranted. A number of considerations confirmed him in his judgment: the many different ways in which the human species could be carved up depending on the anthropometric measurement being employed, the relative insignificance of physiological differences compared with the characteristics which are common to all mankind, the observed prevalence of interracial fertility, and the intermediate forms and mutability of species that Darwin, whose findings were favorable to the theory of the unity of mankind, had established. His conclusion was simply that the doctrine of the unity of mankind does not contradict any certain physiological conclusions. In the United States, Clarence Walworth, a Catholic convert, Redemptorist missionary, and friend of John Henry Newman, took up the subject in his 1863 book entitled The Gentle Skeptic. This work, one of exceedingly few on science subjects by Catholic authors in the period, employed a dialogical style to raise scientific questions and provide suitable Catholic responses. It became clear that the mouthpiece for Walworth found Augustine's figurative understanding of the Genesis days of creation persuasive and was pleased to report that this interpretation was confirmed in the writings of Origen and other fathers. On the geological challenge and indeed on the Darwinian question, which he simply rejected as scientifically speculative and thus inadequate, he was entirely sanguine, but the multiple Adams and Eves of the anthropologists were profoundly troubling. The unity of the human species lay at the bedrock of the Catholic Church, and any compromise on universal Adamic descent would simply rip apart the whole fabric of the Christian faith. To account for racial divergence, Walworth proposed that differentiation was effected both by the accumulation of small, naturally occurring variations and by sudden saltations operating under the influence of providence. It was the same for Orestes Brownson, another fervent convert, who found Darwinism to be incompatible with his politics on account of its conception of self-development, although this was nothing compared to the challenge of pre- and co-atomism, which could erode the very foundations on which the social order rested. The consanguinity of the human race was a political necessity, for it was the foundation on which the entire edifice of human rights was erected. Explicitly rooted in the Genesis narrative, Brownson's commitment to the solidarity of the race was foundational both to social rights, the rights alike of society in regard to individuals, and of individuals in regard to society, and to international law, and was the only bedrock on which opposition to slavery could coherently be grounded. For Catholics, of course, Brownson insisted that Adam's universal fatherhood was no less a theological dogma. Original sin, the incarnation, redemption, regeneration, indeed all that has hitherto been regarded as distinctively Christian, would have no meaning if the unity of the human race were not a truth. Yet this common humanity did not mean equality. Reusch did not hesitate to engage in racial evaluations, much to the detriment of Aboriginal Australians and certain native Irish. In the former case, the physical and moral degradation of most of the tribes, their cannibalism, and the artificial deformities which they like, made them reminiscent of the ape, the caricature of man. In the latter, their miserable circumstances induced very degraded features, which were the outward sign of low and barbarous conditions of life. For his part, Brownson happily, and much more directly, pronounced that the colored races, the yellow, the olive, the red, the copper-colored, and the black, are inferior to the Caucasian, have departed further from the norma of the species, and approached nearer to the animal, and therefore, like animals, have become more or less subject to the action of the elements. All humans might share universal reason, but they evidently shared it in different degrees. Until well into the post-Darwinian era, then, the confessional certainties of both Protestant and Catholic disciples of Adamic monogenism on both sides of the Atlantic drew sustenance from those anthropological writers who, whether committed to Christianity or not, repudiated an increasingly fashionable polyganism and held resolutely to human descent from a single stock. By the same token, the aggressive advocacy of racial polyganism in anthropological circles, and indeed the persistence of a substream of ethnological work retaining the language of atomism and pre-atomism, did raise doubts in the minds of some apologists. Should polygamist anthropology come to be vindicated, these commentators pondered, the pre-Adamite strategy might yet salvage scriptural authority from profane science. And provisional. Even while monogenists were continuing to question polyganism's theological and scientific legitimacy, there were those who could see the functional value of pre-Adamism as a last line of religious defense against skeptical science. Certainly, as often as not, such observers remained uncommitted to non-Adamic humanity, but they wanted to leave the scheme as a viable strategy should science's darker speculations come to be verified. In the 1870s, especially in the wake of Lane and McCausland's proposals, some theological conservatives thus began to toy with making their peace with the pre-Adamite. To be sure, such anticipatory tactics were not altogether new. John Pye Smith, Congregationalist clergyman, theologian at Hamerton College, and harmonizing geologist, had mapped out as early as 1839 the theological path to be followed should polyganism come to be vindicated. His election to Fellowship of the Geological Society of London in 1836, and, 4 years later, to the Royal Society indicates something of the regard in which his scientific work was held. But he also had a significant reputation as a biblical scholar who was thoroughly acquainted with continental critics such as Wilhelm Martin Lieberecht of Etta, Abraham Kuenen, and Karl Heinrich Roth, and who had reworked the traditional understanding of inspiration to allow, as John Calvin had done, for the language of divine revelation to be accommodated to the cultural condition of the biblical writers. In 1838 he brought out a short volume aimed at a youthful audience on the Mosaic account of the creation and the deluge, illustrated by the discoveries of modern science, and the following year he published his magnum opus, The Relation Between the Holy Scriptures and Some Parts of Geological Science. This was the printed version of the Congregationalist lectures he had delivered the previous spring, in which he defended a local deluge, a long Earth history, and the likelihood that animal life had been created in several different regional centers. Geological questions were certainly to the fore in this analysis, as he dealt with traditional points of conflict, the age of the Earth, the fossil record, the days of creation, animal death before the fall, Noah's flood, and so on, but Smith also kept a close eye on anthropological developments. In his discussion of human origins he acknowledged that it was certainly not an impossibility that the Almighty Creator should have seen fit to bring originally into being duplicates, triplicates, or other multiples of pairs, formed so alike that there should be no specific difference between them. But he declared that he himself thought this antecedently improbable. He did confess, however, that naturally observed variation had yet to show how a black complexion could be derived from a white forebear. The absence of an explanatory mechanism that dealt adequately with the physiology of the mucous membrane, together with historical evidence of racial fixity since ancient times, left him wondering, and he eagerly anticipated the third volume of Pritchard's great work in hopes of finding an answer. Hitherto Pritchard's research had provided good physical, philological, and historical evidence in proof of the unity of the human race, by derivation from one ancestry. Still, there were niggling doubts. As he went on, but, if the progress of investigation should bring out such kinds and degrees of evidence, as shall rightfully turn the scale in favor of the hypothesis that there are several races of mankind, each having originated in a different pair of first ancestors, what would be the consequence to our highest interests, as rational, accountable, and immortal beings? Some strategy was evidently needed in such an eventuality, and pre-Adamism remained an acceptable option. If the two first inhabitants of Eden were the progenitors, not of all human beings, but only of the race whence sprung the Hebrew family, Smith mused, still they were formed by the immediate power of God. Pre-Adamism did not deny creation, it confirmed it. Besides, the theological significance of Adam as a figure of him that was to come remained in place, the spiritual lesson would be the same. Indeed, Smith told his readers that Isaac La Peyrère and Edward King had already shown how some difficulties in the scripture history would be taken away, such as, the sons of Adam obtaining wives, not their own sisters, Cain's acquiring instruments of husbandry, which have been furnished by miracle immediately from God upon the usual supposition. And needless to say, pre-Adamism would handsomely accommodate the sorts of racial distinction that Morton was so enthusiastically promulgating on the other side of the Atlantic. The troublesome issue of original sin, so critical to Catholic rebuttals of non-Adamic humanity, was not a source of significant concern to Smith either. To him universal sinfulness was simply an empirical fact, there were frankly too many painfully demonstrated proofs to deny it. And as for the transmission of Adam's transgression to all humanity, Smith went on, the way and manner in which moral corruption thus infected all men, under their several heads of primeval ancestry, would be an inscrutable mystery, which it is now, but the need of divine mercy and the duty to seek it would be the same. As an anticipative tactic, should Praetorian monogenesis succumb to polygynist incursion, pre-Adamism offered a way out. Thus, if this great question should ever be determined in the way opposite to what we now think the verdict of truth, the highest interests of man will not be affected. Some 30 years later on, another Congregationalist clergyman, Joseph Parrish Thompson, adopted a similar anticipative strategy. An editor of The Independent and co-founder of the New Englander and successively minister in New Haven and New York City, Thompson developed interests both in Oriental scholarship, particularly Egypt, and in the relations between science and faith. In 1870 the publication of his Man in Genesis and Geology added to his corpus of writing, many in pamphlet form, on theological subjects, politics, biography, and a photographic survey of Egypt. Later, in 1874, he provided a demographic analysis of the ethnic composition of the United States for the Glasgow meeting of the Association for the Promotion of Social Science, in which the anti-slavery sentiments he had worked out nearly 20 years earlier reasserted themselves. In Man in Genesis and Geology, which began as a sequence of lectures to his own congregation, Thompson announced his preemptive policy on the anthropological challenge. While the doctrine of Perrier, La Perrier, of Bordeaux, in the 17th century, in his famous treatise on the pre-Adamites, which has been revived of late by an anonymous English author, Poole's presentation of Lane's account, Thompson noted, was open to some serious objections. It serves to show one possible way in which the Bible and science may yet be harmonized upon the question of the antiquity of man and the unity of the race. It may prove eventually that there is in this brief record in Genesis a margin for all the discoveries of science. For the moment, however, Thompson was not quite prepared to throw his weight behind the proposal until the scientific evidence forced him into a corner. This was a familiar stratagem. Throughout the book Thompson characteristically accumulated subjunctives. If the date of ancient monuments could be fixed, if the age of excavated human artifacts could be determined precisely, if the historical differentiation of languages could be elucidated, then, and only then, certain steps might be taken. For the present he repeatedly called upon the witness of those exploiting scientific uncertainty, Carl Folk's insistence that rates of peat deposit, from which ancient tools were being excavated, remained unknown, John Cleghorn's challenge to the vast antiquity claimed by Samuel Lying for prehistoric remains in Caithness, the Anthropological Review's admission that every scientific opinion is speculative and that there was no opinion current among scientific men. That is not essentially provisional. But readers could not rely on scientific doubt to preserve the Bible. For Thompson conceded that the data did indeed call for an extension of time considerably beyond the computed chronology of the Bible. Even a conservative dating of Egyptian monuments and the unchanging appearance of leading types of mankind, as far back as we can trace these in history, forced him to anticipate what principles of adjustment between science and the scriptures should be put in place. Well-established facts about philological diversification and distribution and fossil evidence of human existence during the last glacial age only confirmed his judgment. La Perrier's pre-Adamites waited patiently in the wings. The year following the publication of Thompson's book, 1871, a volume entitled The Beginning, It's When and It's How made its appearance. It was authored by Mungo Pantone, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, author of a variety of works on optics, the electric telegraph, and devotional subjects, and a photographic inventor. Quite appropriately, The Beginning was spiced with a series of luscious paleontological illustrations. Like Thompson, Pantone came close to bringing the pre-Adamites onto the theological stage. The whole subject of the unity and antiquity of the human race, he maintained, is still involved in too much obscurity to admit of the formation of any decided opinion. But in his exposition of what he called the sixth creative epoch, he affirmed that should the evidence then ultimately prove sufficient to establish the existence of races of men older than the Caucasian, it would not be difficult to reconcile the Hebrew narrative with such a state of affairs. There was always the pre-Adamite safety valve. There may have been a Negro Adam, a Mongolian Adam, and perhaps 2 or 3 more besides the Caucasian Adam, he affirmed, and they may have been formed either at the same time or in a sequence of separate creations. Pantone did not explicitly endorse such a revisionist scheme. All that has been attempted here, he commented, is to show that there is, in the Hebrew narratives, nothing inconsistent with the hypothesis that there may have been several primitive races of men, each starting from an Adam, a man formed from the ground by some gradual process analogous to those by which, even at the present time, perfect organisms are slowly elaborated from the most minute and rudimentary organic elements. Even if these writers could not yet bring themselves to welcome the pre-Adamites onto the platform of history, they were happy to keep them on backstage retainer should their presence eventually be called for. In one form or another, pre-Adamism thus continued to cast its shadow as much over anthropological science as theological apologetics. Whether in the writings of those we examined earlier who sought religious accommodation to geology, archaeology, and linguistics, in the discourse of mid-19th century ethnology and anthropology, or in the theological writings of those who kept a close eye on this new science of man, the question of Adam's identity and lineage, and the possibility that he might not have been alone, persistently reasserted itself.